Thank you very much to NOSAS and especially to James for inviting me to speak this evening. When I first accepted, I said I would talk about early medieval Nairnshire, but my topic has expanded quite a bit since then, hopefully in a good way. So I'm going to be talking about the evidence for two possible early medieval kingdoms on the Moray Firth between 700 and 900. So not quite 700 and 1000, James. I think I've narrowed it down slightly since I gave you the abstract. So 700 and 900. So this is really my master's research, and it's the first time that I've shared it publicly, and I'm really happy that I'm sharing it to a home crowd. So that the places and the sites and the sculpture and the objects that I'm going to talk about will be very familiar to you. In some cases, more familiar to you than maybe they are to me. So some of the conclusions that I've drawn are quite speculative, and I'd be very keen to hear your thoughts. So I'm happy to take any feedback or questions after the talk. So to put the talk into context, it was really, well, this topic was really inspired by Martin Carver's dig at Portmahomack. I'm sure it needs no introduction for this audience, but just as a summary, Martin and his team were digging there from 1997 to 2007. And they found that between around 680 and 810 AD, the site at St. Colman's Church here hosted a large, wealthy and sophisticated Pictish monastery, producing high-quality stone sculpture, illuminated manuscripts and fine metalwork. The monastery seems to have been largely destroyed in a violent raid around 800, and no record of it has survived in textual sources, not even its name. In 2008, Martin Carver gave that year's Grome House academic lecture, in which he concluded this from the evidence at Portmahomack. Northern Pictland in the 8th century was a great maritime Christian kingdom, focused on the Moray Firth and in touch with the international European scene. In his book, Portmahomack Monastery of the Picts, he marks out this great maritime kingdom with a dotted line and shows it alongside other kingdoms of the post-Roman North Sea region. So this piqued my interest as a historian, because a great maritime kingdom in touch with the European scene ought to be visible in the textual record. But textual sources for the Moray Firthlands in the late 1st millennium AD are virtually non-existent, making it very difficult to understand what was going on here. As David Brun has said, for the 8th and 9th centuries, the political situation in northern Pictland is almost impenetrably obscure. So as James mentioned, it is possible to argue that the Firthlands hosted the Pictish over-kingdom of Fortriu, and Alex Wolff did make that argument very persuasively in 2006. But in reality, when you look at the 16 or so mentions of Fortriu in the early sources, they're frustratingly vague. The most frustrating thing about them, to my mind, is that they don't connect any kings or bishops of Fortriu with any recognisable place in the Firthlands. On the few occasions where a king or chief bishop of Fortriu is associated with a real place, those places are in Perthshire. The Annals of Ulster tell us that Constantine, son of Fergus, was king of Fortriu, but he is commemorated in an inscription on the Duplin cross at Fortiviot. And the Annals say that Tuathal, son of Artgus, was chief bishop of Fortriu, but also that he was abbot at Dunkeld. Disappointingly, we don't see any sign of Portmahomack or Burghead or Rosemarkie in any of these mentions. However, separately from Fortriu, we can see tiny glimpses of the Firthlands in the early sources. There are only 4 brief mentions in the entire textual canon for the 9th and 10th centuries that we know of, but they're very intriguing. Together, they suggest that the Firthlands hosted not one great maritime Christian kingdom, but rather 2 small territories, and they have reassuringly familiar names, Ros and Moreb, ancestors of Ross and Moray. So if we look at Ros, first of all, it first appears in a 9th century calendar of saints' days known as the Martyrology of Talach. It was compiled at the monastery of Talach in Leinster in Ireland, probably, but not certainly, around 830. However, we only have later copies of it. The original is lost. This particular copy is from the 17th century. For the 16th of March, it has a rather mangled entry listing it as the feast day of St. Curiton, Bishop and Abbot of Rismind Barrand, or as here, Rismic Barrand. For a long time, this place name had scholars stumped, but in 2009, James Fraser showed that the entry actually conflates 2 different clerics. One of them is Men Barron, Abbot of Agabo in County Laois. Removing him leaves the entry as Cureton, Bishop and Abbot of Ross. And this must be none other than the Cureton ep Scop, Bishop Cureton, who is listed as one of the 91 guarantors of the Coin Addhavnon, or the Law of Addhavnon. This was a law protecting non-combatants in battle, drawn up by Addhavnon, the 9th Abbot of Iona, and ratified at the Synod of Birr in the year 697. As many of you will know, Cureton is heavily culted around the Black Isle, Dingwall and Inverness, especially at Rosemarkie, where there is ample evidence of an early monastery. This surely was the location of Cureton's bishop's see. So here is a person who we can confidently place in the Firthlands in the year 697, and whose death day continued to be commemorated into the 9th century and far beyond. But what or where was Ross, the Ross of which Cureton was bishop? Here, scholars are divided. James Fraser envisaged it as Cureton's diocese, which he thought might cover the Black Isle. Simon Taylor saw it as a name for Rosemarkie, the monastery where Cureton was surely abbot. Unfortunately, the place name isn't much help. It could be Gaelic Ross, meaning a headland or point, referring to Chanonry Ness by Rosemarkie, or it could be Brittonic Ross, a moor, which might suit the early medieval landscape of lowland Ross and Cromarty. But an important clue comes from a second source, this time from the late 10th century. This is the hagiography or saint's life of St. Cathro of Metz, who died in around 976. Cathro was a Gael of Irish descent who left North Britain to become a permanent pilgrim on the continent. When his hagiographer, Rymanus, came to write the life of Cathro, he decided to start it with an account of the origins of the Irish, Cathro's ancestors. For this, he used one of the standard early medieval Irish origin legends, except that he added a few details of his own, describing where the Irish first came to settle in North Britain. The bit that interests us is this. Now you've only got it in Latin here, but I'm going to read it out in English. Crossing the sea next to them, they occupied the island of Eua, now called Iona. Not yet content, after surveying the nearby sea of Britain, they settled along the river Rossim in the Regio of Rossia. The Regio of Rossia seems like it might refer to Ross, but to be sure, we have to identify the river here called the Rosis or Rossim. In 1867, W.F. Skene identified it as the Rasay, the old name for the Blackwater, a tributary of the Connon. I'm grateful to Nick Aitchison for pointing out that the old statistical account for Contin Parish confirms this old naming. So we can confidently place the Regio of Rossia in the Firthlands. So we can note a few things here. Firstly, Rymanus calls Ross a Regio, which Patrick O'Rian translated as kingdom, although other translations are available. I've put some up there on the top right-hand side. Secondly, he puts it in the legendary past, suggesting that he considered this kingdom or province to be very old. Thirdly, it has the same name as Bishop Cureton's see, which suggests that Ross was the name of Cureton's wider diocese rather than just his monastery. And that's crucial because elsewhere in early medieval Britain, dioceses aligned with kingdoms. For example, Aidan of Lindisfarne was bishop of a diocese that corresponded with Northumbria. So one conclusion from these two sources would be that around the year 700, there existed a kingdom called Ross that had its own bishop who was based at Rosemarkie, and that this kingdom was either still extant in around 980 when Rymanus wrote his life of Cathro, or that it was at least well remembered at that time. Now, though, let's look at the other early medieval Firthlands territory, Moreb, the ancestor of Moray. Like Ross, it appears in two early sources. Indeed, one of them is the same 9th century martyrology where we first find Ross. This source is actually new for this talk because I wasn't aware of it when I was doing my master's, my MA, and it's very interesting. For the 18th of February, we find commemorated a saint called Colman, whom the martyrology places in Moray to the north of the Mount. Now, Colum or Coleman was a very common name. I think there are 218 saints called Coleman, and the identity of this particular Coleman is unclear. He is sometimes identified with the Coleman who was Bishop of Lindisfarne from 661 to 664. But if Coleman of Moray makes you think of St. Coleman's Church at Portmahomack, then hold that thought because I'll come back to it later. Our second mention of Moray appears in the late 10th century Chronicle of the Kings of Alba, an incredibly important source for 9th and 10th century Scotland. It's a list of kings of Alba descended from Kenneth MacAlpin, with a few details about each one's reign. It's heavily geographically biased towards central Scotland, as you can see by the blue stars here on the map, which means it was probably maintained in the scriptorium at Dunkeld. Now, from Malcolm I of Alba, who reigned from 943 to 954, it notes that the king went into Moreb with his army and slew Kellich. Unfortunately, we don't have any more detail than this, so we don't know who Kellich was. But it seems he was important enough for the king of Alba to go to Moreb himself and kill him, and for this to be one of the very few acts of his reign that was recorded for posterity. So the martyrology of Tallaght suggests that Moray was already in existence in the early 9th century when the calendar was compiled, and the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba suggests that it was separate from Alba in the late 10th century, since the king of Alba went into it with his army. We might also note that Moreb is a Pictish or Brythonic name, meaning something like seashore, which strongly implies that it was named before Gaelic came to the Moray Firth area. So the textual sources are giving us hints that there were two polities in the Moray Firthlands in the late first millennium, and there's a faint hint that at least one of them, Ross, was a kingdom. So my research aimed to find evidence of these two polities on the ground, using distribution maps to plot a variety of early medieval items, phenomena, including sculpture, place names, central places, iconography, inscriptions, and objects. I'm going to go through each one of these and show that it's possible to discern the imprints of Ros and Moreb on the ground. What's more, it turns out that they occupy the land in quite an unexpected way, and they have surprisingly different characters, at least in the 8th century. So this is my first map. I used this to define my area of study. I wanted to visualize where people were most active in the Firthlands at the start of the period I was looking at, so maybe just prior to 700 AD, so that I could try to place Ros and Moreb within that area. So to do that, I took the earliest known locations of all of the class 1 Pictish symbol stones. Those are the gold stars, along with the locations of Pictish monumental cemeteries that were noted by Juliet Mitchell and Gordon Noble in 2017, which are the grey stars. Juliet's actually now updated that data set, and this is her updated data set that I'm showing here, and I'm grateful to Juliet for sharing that with me. So both, I mean, you will probably know more about this than me, but both of these monument types are thought to begin in the late Iron Age and fade out in the 7th century sometime. So class 1 stones, there's some examples here, are stones incised with Pictish symbols, but do not have any Christian iconography. So these examples you see here are from Glen Urquhart, Strathpeffer, and Easterton of Rosile. For those who know about these things, as you can see, I use Google My Maps for my visualizations because that's as much as I can do on the mapping side at the moment. I'm hoping to learn GIS now I'm at Glasgow. But Google is perfectly adequate for mapping specific locations, and you can map up to 10 categories of item together to visualize their relative distributions. So what I noticed here was that these monuments are concentrated on the coastal plains and along the Ness and the Spey. However, moors and uplands look quite empty, but they were surely used for summer grazing of livestock. And there's been long-kissed graves found on the Tarbat Peninsula, so this map doesn't show the full picture. But what it does show is that there's a striking distribution along the Spey, and we can assume that the Spey or its watershed, which I've roughly marked there in blue, was a regional boundary as it was in the later Middle Ages. Now, this map doesn't immediately suggest the presence of two polities, but when I came to map features that are slightly later in date, at least according to the conventional dating, the outlines of two different territories did start to emerge. So the first thing that I looked for was places, well, sort of central places where secular power was concentrated. Not all early medieval kingdoms had a central place of power. For example, in early Anglo-Saxon England, kings were itinerant. They moved around their territory to emphasize and maintain their ruler status. But other kingdoms did have a central place. For For example, the kingdom of Altclut or Strathclyde had its capital at Dumbarton Rock. It seemed to me that there were two central places in the Firthlands at the start of the 8th century, at Inverness and at Burgh Head. So we know about Inverness from Adamnon's Life of Columba, which was written around 700. Adamnon describes Columba's visits to the Pictish king Bryddau at his fort on the River Ness in the late 6th century. However, historians tend to view the incidental detail in the life of Columba as reflective of Adamnan's own time rather than Columba's time. So we can assume that the fort was in existence in 700. And as you'll know, it's usually thought to have been at Craigfadrig. But if you trace Columba's footsteps as described by Adamnan, a different location suggests itself. So these are the clues that Adamnan gives us. Columba approaches Inverness via Glen Urquhart on the west side of Loch Ness. At one point, he has to cross the River Ness, for which a boat is available. That was actually the point at which he encountered the river monster. And I think it's quite funny that I'm more interested in the boat than the monster. So the fort, Bryddau's fort, is up a steep path and it's close to the river. So there are 3 forts in the area of Inverness, which you might say were up a steep path. And the 2 that are closest to the river are Torveen and the Inverness Castle Hill. Craigfadrig, by contrast, is quite a bit further away from the river. Columba also has to cross the river, which suggests that the fort wasn't perhaps at Torveen. And I also think that Torveen, again, you might know more than me, I think Torveen is quite a small fort, and Adamnan describes Bryddau's fort as being quite big and capacious. So I think that the most, if Columba had to cross the river, I think that the most convenient place to cross would be at the Ness Islands. And intriguingly, a Pictish carved bullstone was found right there, just opposite the islands. And these standalone carved bulls have only been found at Inverness, Burgh Head, and at the hill fort of East Lomond in Fife, another place of secular Pictish power. It's possible that they relate to cattle as the main form of wealth, and perhaps to cattle tribute being brought to these central places on the hoof. If we put all these things together, the location that really best fits Adamnan's description is the Castle Hill of Inverness. In fact, this was the location favoured by Leslie and Elizabeth Alcock, among others. So we can perhaps think of Inverness as a place of royal power in the year 700 when Adamnan was writing. But in that case, what are we to make of Burgh Head? Adamnan doesn't show Columba visiting Burgh Head, but it's increasingly clear from the archaeology that it was an incredibly important place in the late 1st millennium. So combined with the I've gone too far. So combined with the early mentions of Ros and Moreb in the sources, I started to think of Inverness as being the central place of Ros and Burgh Head as the central place of Moreb. The next thing I thought about was ecclesiastical central places. The biggest monasteries would have been given land, patronage, and protection by secular rulers, who would in turn benefit from spiritual endorsement of their ruler status and divine assistance in battle. It would make sense then that the region's 3 big monasteries at Rosemarkie, Kinedder, and Portmahomack were sponsored by local secular rulers. So which secular centres were they associated with? In fact, it's quite easy to associate Rosemarkie with Inverness. They're physically quite close to each other, and they share a link with Iona. Adamnan shows us Columba visiting a king in Inverness, and Curaton of Ross was the only bishop from Pictland to endorse Adamnan's Law of the Innocents. It is not hard to envisage a king in Inverness granting land at Rosemarkie for the founding of a monastery. This would make Inverness and Rosemarkie the chief places of a kingdom of Ross. Likewise, it's quite easy to associate Kinedder with Burgh Head. They're less than 10 miles apart at either end of the island of Duffus. And as we'll see, the David sculpture at Kinedder suggests that there was royal patronage there. And we can therefore envisage them as chief places of a kingdom of Moreb. The tricky one is Portmahomack. We might expect it to have been in Ross, since the Tarbat Peninsula has been at the heart of Ross since records began in the 12th century. But as we'll see, my research strongly suggests that before the arrival of the Norse, the Tarbat Peninsula was part of Moray, and that Portmahomack too was associated with Burgh Head. In the early medieval period, the sea was a connector and travel between Berghead and Tarbat would have been relatively unproblematic. And Portmahomack is physically closer to Berghead and Kinneda than it is to Inverness and Rosemarkie. So the textual sources and central places together suggest two petty kingdoms of Ros and Moreb, at least in the early 8th century, with their central places provisionally arranged like this. So the next thing I did was try to identify the rough extent of each of these petty kingdoms. I did this by mapping essentially every piece of early medieval evidence I could get data for and examining their distributions. The evidence had to be relatively immobile because small portable items like ring pins and brooches could have come from anywhere and wouldn't be a reliable guide to political geography. So the first thing I looked at was class 2 cross slabs. So these are dressed stone slabs with a Christian cross on one side and Pictish symbols carved in relief on the other. There are 11 of these in the area that I've defined as the Firthlands. They're usually dated to the 8th or 9th century on stylistic grounds. So at first glance, they occur throughout the region, but a closer look shows that they're concentrated east of Nairn and on the Tarbat Peninsula. So separately, I'd been doing some reading about river watersheds forming early territorial boundaries in Anglo-Saxon England. And it struck me that if I drew a line roughly along the watershed of the Nairn and the Findhorn, the class 2 slabs in Moray and Nairnshire would all lie to the east of it. Intriguingly, the northernmost point of this theoretical boundary, which I've circled in red there, is exactly where we find the modern boundary between Nairnshire and Moray, or between Highland region and Moray, on the Hardmuir between Aldern and Brodie. It is, in fact, the boundary between the parishes of Aldern and Dyke and Moy. These parishes were established in the 12th century, but scholars like John Rogers have argued that parishes in Scotland were formed out of pre-existing territorial units. This made me think that I may be looking at a very old boundary indeed, possibly the boundary between the Ros and Moreb of the early sources. So this is where you have to bear with my thinking a little bit. So I was already thinking that class 2 slabs might be more of a Moravian phenomenon and that the Tarbat Peninsula might have once been part of Moray. So I drew a very tentative outline of these two territories, and it turned out that because there's a class 2 cross slab at Golspie, that it also, as I tentatively saw it, also encompassed the Dornoch Firth and Golspie there. So you may have all kinds of objections to this, but when I started to map the other features, these outlines got stronger and stronger. So the next thing I looked at was place names starting with the element kill. Kill here, or K-I-L as it is in Kiltality there, which is Gaelic for church. It's usually found with the saint's name as the suffix, and it's often been cited as evidence of the first wave of Gaelicization of Pictland, although in reality it's not quite that straightforward, as some kill names were coined as late as the 16th century. However, when Simon Taylor analysed the distribution of this place name element in the mid-1990s, he identified two distinct clusters in the Firthlands, one around Inverness, Dingwall and Rosemarkie, and one around Brore and Helmsdale and Sutherland. He proposed that these clusters are evidence of the first wave of Gaelicization, which he dated to the early 8th century. So when I applied my same outlines to this map, all but one of these kill places fell outside of the area that I'd tentatively thought of as Moray. You can see that most evidently around the Tarbat Peninsula and the Dornoch Firth, where the distribution actually creates a negative imprint of what I was thinking of as Moreb or Moray. So it seemed to me that whatever agency was behind the foundation of these kill churches in the early 8th century, it was highly active in Ross and almost non-existent in Moreb. So here I thought again about Cureton. He was Bishop of Ross in 697, pretty much the same time period as Simon Taylor ascribed to the kill names. In fact, Simon saw the kill churches as dependent on the monastery at Rosemarkie, and Kenneth Veitch actually proposed that Cureton was responsible for founding these kill churches. So I mapped the dedications to Cureton in the region using Glasgow University's Saints Places database, which is a really reliable source of data on what seemed to be original saints' dedications. And again, they all fell into the area that I was thinking of as Ross. So here I should say that at some point in the later Middle Ages, Cureton acquired an alter ego and became known as Cureton Boniface. But in the earliest sources where he appears, in the law of Addefnon and the martyrology of Tallaght, he is just named Cureton. And these are the only place names anywhere in Scotland that are dedicated to Cureton under that name. So this makes me think that Cureton has been mistakenly conflated with Boniface, and that the real Cureton was purely the Bishop of Ross, a diocese and a kingdom whose outline we're starting to see here, especially when we map kiln names and Cureton dedications together. Now, this next one is also new for this talk, because I didn't look at this in my master's. So I've already discussed the close links between this early medieval territory of Ross and Iona. Addefnon showed Columba coming to Inverness, but not to Burghead, and Cureton was the only cleric from Pictland to guarantee Addefnon's law, protecting non-combatants. So perhaps dedications to Columba could also shed some light on the political geography of the region. Now, here we have to be extremely careful, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of dedications to Columba all over Scotland, but many of them are comparatively recent. So for guidance, I once again used Glasgow's database of genuinely early saints dedications in place names. I only chose the names that they categorized as certain or probable, leaving out maybe and doubtful. And this shows a faint trail of Columba dedications up the side of Loch Ness, at Petty near Inverness, and up into Easter Ross. And separately, because this one isn't in the Saints Places database, Alistair Ross had identified a lost dedication to Columba at Aldern, which has all the hallmarks of being early as well. So here with the outlines again, kiln place names, dedications to Cureton and dedications to Columba all fall outside of the area that I'm thinking of as Moreb. Indeed, they mostly fall into the area that I've been thinking of as Ross, although the data is revealing some activity in Sutherland, which would be really worth investigating, I think. So here it's worth thinking again about Portmahomack. The Saints Places project has this down as a maybe dedication to Columba, since both Columba and Colman come from the same Latin word columba, meaning dove. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, there's another obscure saint called Colman, who the 9th century martyrology of Tallaght associates with Moray. My research here suggests that the Tarbat Peninsula was in Moray, or in Moreb, so it might be worth looking again at which saint is commemorated in this place name. But that's also a project for another time. So just to recap on what we've covered so far, the early written sources suggest there were two small territories in the Moray Firthlands called Ros and Moreb. Mapping central places, class 2 Pictish cross slabs and place names strongly suggest that Ross was a territory centred on Inverness, which roughly encompassed the Black Isle, Inner Easter Ross, the Aird, and the environs of Loch Ness, stretching eastwards to the watershed between the Nairn and the Findhorn. Moray, or Moreb, meanwhile, seems to have stretched from the watershed of the Findhorn across to the Spey, and also crossed the Moray Firth to include the Tarbat Peninsula and the low-lying areas around the Dornoch Firth and Gulspie. So how far these territories might have extended into the uplands, I'm not sure. It's difficult to tell because there are few material or archaeological remains to guide us. And I've just guessed here at their highland boundaries. But I haven't even really guessed. I've just drawn a line. If you have some thoughts on that, I would be really interested and happy to hear them. So what's really interesting is that there are some notable differences emerging between these two territories, and these differences apparently start in the late 7th or early 8th century. Ross seems to be well connected with Iona and seems to have been Gallicized earlier than Moreb, if we can use its kiln place names as evidence of early Gallicization. In Moreb, on the other hand, we only find one ecclesiastical kiln name, but we do find a relative profusion of class 2 slabs with prominent Pictish symbols. Now the colours here, so the red stars are the kiln names and the purple stars are the class 2 cross slabs. So these class 2 cross slabs also tend to be dated to the 8th century, particularly the magnificent slabs on the Tarbat Peninsula. So to me, it seems that there are two different ecclesiastical cultures emerging in these territories in the 8th century. In Ross, it appears to be a Gaelic culture, Churches are being named with kill, very few class 2 slabs are being raised. The predominant churchman that we know of, Curaton, is politically connected to Addhavnon and therefore to Iona, and Addhavnon is keen to show Columba visiting the Inverness area in the life of Columba. My own feeling is that it was actually Addhavnon, not Columba, who visited Inverness. The accuracy of his descriptions of the area suggests that he came north himself, perhaps to visit Curaton to solicit his support for his law of protecting non-combatants. I can imagine that Addhavnon then set some of his miracle stories about Columba in the area, perhaps to emphasize that Ross was very much part of the Columban world. That's my feeling, but please feel free to ignore it. But in Moreb, meanwhile, we have ecclesiastical patrons raising enormous cross slabs with very prominent Pictish symbols, as if they really want to emphasize a Pictish identity and heritage. Now, I would tentatively suggest that this is some kind of response or reaction to the ecclesiastical Gallicization in Ross. It is as if they're saying, you may be Gaelic now, but we are still Pictish. It's important to stress that this is about identity, and specifically elite and church-related self-identity. It's not about ethnicity. I'm not proposing that Ross was purely inhabited by Gaelic-speaking immigrants, or that Moreb had an entirely Pictish-speaking indigenous population. In reality, it would have been very fuzzy. Many people were probably bilingual, or perhaps even trilingual if they knew Latin. They would have intermixed and intermarried, and different views would have held sway in different places and at different times. As evidence of that, we have a cross slab with Pictish symbols at Conan Bridge and a Gaelic hill place name near Elgin. And there's even a massive cross slab with Pictish symbols at Rosemarkie, the place I'm envisaging as the heart of ecclesiastical Ross. But I propose that something is going on in the 8th century that makes elite patrons of ecclesiastical sculpture in Moreb want to express a strongly Pictish identity. And that same impulse seems to be largely absent in Ross. So that brings me to my next map. So whatever it was that drove the elites of Moreb to express a conspicuously Pictish identity in the 8th century, it seems to have gone right to the top. This is the distribution of sculpture with iconography of the biblical King David. Isabel Henderson identified images of David on sculpture at Kineda, Nig and Kincardine, and more questionably, since David himself is not shown, at Hilton of Cadboll. Jane Geddes has also recently identified an image of David on Swano Stone near Forres, as we'll see in a moment. Now, as you can see from the inset map there, these are the only locations in the whole of northern Pictland with David imagery. It's striking that this distribution extends across coastal parts of the territory that I'm identifying as Moreb and not in the territory that I'm identifying as Ross at all. So I'm not an art historian, so I have to lean on interpretations of this iconography made by scholars like Isabel Henderson and Jane Geddes and Donald Bullock. They say that David is generally recognizable in Pictish art, either by his harp or by the fact that he's rending the jaws of a lion from 1 Samuel 17, verses 34 to 35, when he protects his father Saul's sheep from a lion and a bear. Jane Geddes has also reanalyzed the inauguration scene on Swano Stone near Forres as an image of the arming of David. And her article with that interpretation will be published shortly in PSAS. So what does this iconography mean? Donald Bullock noted that in Pictish art, more than in any other early medieval European tradition, David is intended to symbolize a contemporary ruler. He ventured that the elaborateness and quality of these stones raises the possibility that they were a visual expression of the authority of the last independent kings of the Picts. Now, my feeling is that given that David imagery doesn't appear anywhere else north of the Cairngorms, and given that Moreb appears as a political entity in the early textual sources, it is possible to interpret these monuments as sculpture sponsored by 8th and 9th century kings of Moreb. I propose that in common with southern Pictish kings, these kings saw the biblical David as symbolic of their own Christian kingship, and that by commissioning sculpture with images of David, they too were asserting a strongly Pictish identity. Now, Jane Geddes has noted that in southern Pictland, David imagery tends to appear at central and boundary locations. And we can see the same pattern here with David at the core of 8th century Moreb at Kinneda, and at what I'm proposing as the northwestern boundary of Moreb at the tidal limit of the Moray Firth at Kincardine. It's also possible to see the superb cross slab at Nig as standing in a boundary location. Facing it across the Bay of Nig is Kilmuir, one of the kill churches in Ross. And as you can see on this map, this old map here, this 17th century map, the Bay of Nig seems to have extended much further inland in the pre-improvement era, creating more of a geographical division between Ross and Moreb in this area. So there are two more distributions that I want to talk about briefly. These are definitely more speculative and probably need a lot more work, so feel free to take them with a pinch of salt. The first one is quadrangular iron handbells. There are only 2 surviving examples of these in the Firthlands, one at Corder, which is the one shown here, and one at Burney in Moray, just by Elgin. They're both among the largest examples of the type, about 30 centimetres tall. These bells are highly distinctive, and the leading expert, Cormac Bourke, sees them as diagnostic of the activity of the Columban Church in Scotland. There are, or were, several such bells in Highland Perthshire, which you can see on the inset map, at churches with dedications to Addovnon and other abbots of Iona. So given that Columban connection, we shouldn't be surprised to find a bell of this type in Ross at Corder, since we have seen it had strong links with Iona. It's more surprising to find a bell of this type at Burney, since there's little other evidence of a Columban cult, early Columban cult in Moray. What makes it more intriguing is that there's good evidence that there was once a bell of this type at Aldern, which in my view was like Corder in the Kingdom of Ross. In his 2003 PhD thesis, Alistair Ross noted evidence of an early Columban cult at Aldern, including indications that the church there had once had a bell associated with a plot of land. As Ross notes, in the pre-Reformation church, it was customary for there to be a hereditary doer to look after the church's relics, who would receive a plot of land in return for this service. An early handbell is a classic example of a relic. They were believed to possess the power of the saint, in this case Columba, and they were often later enshrined with decorative bronze metalwork, like this example from Kilmichael Glassery in Argyll. So I think it's at least possible that the bell at Burney is the missing bell from Aldern, although I don't have any evidence for that. All I can say is that we know that the first Anglo-Norman Bishop of Moray was appointed by Alexander I in 1107, and that Burney was the first see of the 12th century Moray bishops. I think it is possible that the bell was transferred from Aldern to Burney to legitimise its status as an episcopal see. I absolutely can't prove that, and scholars like Richard Oram and Alex Wolfe have argued persuasively that the earliest bishops of Moray did not have a fixed see in the region and instead travelled with the court of the King of Scots. So this may just be wishful thinking to support my argument, but it is something that I plan to look into for my PhD, so watch this space. The last distribution that I want to talk about is similarly sketchy. It relates to Ogham inscriptions, which are found on Class 2 and Class 3 cross slabs at Golspie, Brodie and Alter. It should be noted that the Brodie slab was found in 1781 near Dyke Church, and the Alter slab was brought to Alter in about 1820 from Roseisle near Burgh Head. So I've mapped those earlier locations here. All 3 of these slabs fall into the area that I'm proposing as Moreb. And given this distribution, I wonder if their inscriptions are also part of the same impulse to express a Pictish identity. It may seem odd to claim that a script that originated in Ireland could be used as a marker of Pictish identity, but Ogham does seem to have been embraced with enthusiasm in Pictland, while it is comparatively lacking in the Gaelic west of Scotland. Interestingly, the name inscribed on the Brodie stone seems to be Ethanan, who appears to be a Pictish saint. But then one of the people commemorated on the Golspie stone seems to have a Gaelic name, Fercha, so this theory definitely needs some more work. So I've shown you that these mapping exercises seem to reveal the imprints of the 2 early kingdoms of Ross and Moreb mentioned in the early sources. Ros seems to have been Gallicized and connected to Iona, perhaps due to its position at the head of the Great Glen, while Moreb seems to have doubled down on its native Pictishness in the 8th century, raising huge cross slabs with prominent Pictish symbols, evoking the biblical King David, beloved of Pictish royalty, and perhaps using Ogham script as a further marker of Pictishness. To me, this suggests that these two polities had rulers with enough autonomy to make their own decisions, especially regarding ecclesiastical organisation in their territory, which I think is further evidence in favour of there being two kingdoms rather than one great maritime Christian kingdom in the Firthlands. But it is possible that Ros and Moreb were two provinces of a single kingdom, with sub-rulers who from time to time enjoyed a degree of autonomy. And as most of the evidence is ecclesiastical, it's also possible that we're seeing two different dioceses, although dioceses did seem to align with kingdoms in the early Middle Ages. I'd be interested in anybody's thoughts on this afterwards. So what happened? What happened to Ros and Moreb after the 8th century? So I think we could probably all guess at the general answer to that question. Like the rest of Britain and Ireland, they suffered at the hands of Norse raiders and then settlers. The monastery at Portmahomack certainly experienced a devastating raid between 780 and 810, with its buildings burned, sculpture smashed up, and at least some of its clerics dying in violent circumstances. Though we can't know for sure that the perpetrators were Scandinavian, it certainly fits with the pattern of Norse raiding around the coasts of Britain and Ireland. The raid on Portmahomack doesn't appear in any textual source, but this isn't surprising since, as I mentioned earlier, there are barely any contemporary written sources for the Firthlands for the period 700 to 1000. However, we do have some highly problematic sources in the Icelandic sagas, which were compiled in the 13th and 14th centuries using older material from both written and oral tradition. It's very hard to separate fact from fiction in the sagas, but they do contain some information about northern Scotland in the late 9th century that is especially interesting in light of the other evidence I've looked at here. In particular, they tell us about the exploits of two individuals, Sigurd the Mighty, who is said to have been the first Earl of Orkney, not first Norse Earl of Orkney, and Thorstein the Red, who is said to have been the son of Olaf the White, king of Viking Dublin, the first king of Viking Dublin. Historians often doubt the historical value of these accounts because neither Sigurd nor Thorstein are mentioned in the Irish annals or in any other contemporary insular source. There's no doubt, though, that the compilers of the Icelandic sagas thought that they had been real. So this is what the sagas tell us about Sigurd and Thorstein. So Orkneyinga saga says, Earl Sigurd became a great ruler. He joined forces with Thorstein the Red, and together they conquered the whole of Caithness and a large part of Argyll, Moray and Ross. Sigurd had a stronghold built in the south of Moray. Landnámabók says, Thorstein was made king over these conquered lands until he was defeated in battle by the Scots. And Laxdæla saga says, Thorstein plundered and raided in many parts of Scotland. He made peace with the Scots and became the ruler of half the Scottish kingdom. The Scots only kept the peace for a short time before breaking their pact with Thorstein. He was killed at Caithness. Now, since there's no evidence of Norse occupation, such as place names or furnished pagan burials on the southern shore of the Moray Firth, historians have tended to view these tales as garbled exaggerations or events that maybe didn't even happen at all. But if we accept that the Tarbak Peninsula and the shores around the Dornoch Firth were part of Moreb prior to the arrival of the Norse, then these stories become somewhat more plausible. In such a scenario, Sigurd and Thorstein may indeed have captured a large part of Moray and Ross, their northernmost parts, in which case we might want to look for Sigurd's stronghold either on the Tarbak Peninsula or along the southern shore of the Dornoch Firth. So according to the saga chronologies, this conflict between the Scots and the Norse over parts of Ross and Moray took place in the last quarter of the 9th century. It is just possible that the martial scenes on Sweno stone show these events from the home side. The art historical consensus has long been that the stone dates from 850 to 950, often leaning towards the earlier part of that period, so it fits chronologically. And interestingly, Ruth Logie and Gordon Noble have recently had new radiocarbon dating done on the material taken from these large post holes, F5 and F33, I think both, maybe just F5, from these large post holes in front of the stone. So these post holes were interpreted by Rod McCullough in 1995 as evidence of supports for the crane or the derrick that was originally used to raise the stone up to the vertical. The new dating has produced a range of 780 to 900 at 95% probability and 825 to 885 at 68% probability for activity relating to these post holes. So the carbon dating and the art historical dating for the stone now overlap in the period 850 to 900. According to the saga chronology, Sigurd and Thorstein conquered parts of Moray and Ross sometime between 870 and 890. Since Laxdæla saga hints that Thorstein's rulership over these lands was short-lived, we could imagine the conquest happening around 880, the battle in which Thorstein was defeated happening in 885, and the stone being raised in around 890. But how plausible is this, actually? Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. So how plausible is this, actually? Well, for what it's worth, we know that from the first mention of it in 1654, the stone has been thought to commemorate a victory over the Danes, meaning the Vikings. And a new development is that, as I mentioned earlier, Professor Jane Geddes has just conducted a thorough reassessment of the stone's iconography based on new high-res drawings made by John Borland and now published on Canmore. I don't want to steal Jane Geddes's thunder as her article is coming out soon in PSAS, but some of it has been trailed in the P&J, and she does make some interesting new proposals. One is that we should read this inauguration scene under the cross as an icon of the arming of David. If you recall, David is offered arms to fight Goliath, but he refuses them. He knows that God is with him and will ensure his victory. We've seen that David was used by Pictish kings as a symbol of their own Christian kingship. We've also seen that a seam of 8th century David imagery runs through the coastal parts of the territory I've identified as Moreb, like this recumbent from Kincardine and this fragment from Kinedda. So we could surmise from this that Sweno stone was raised in the late 9th century by a Christian king who wanted to make a symbolic connection between himself and earlier kings of Moreb, perhaps to evoke the days when Moreb still ruled over the lands conquered by the Northmen. Jane Geddes has also noted that the battle face of the stone contains images that in John Borland's new high-res drawings look very like horses being sacrificed for burial with fallen warriors. And this practice is actually attested in the Killoran Bay boat burial on Colonsay, where a horse was buried alongside the interred person. Killoran Bay is generally interpreted as a Norse burial, and it dates from exactly the same period in the late 9th century as the events we're talking about here. So from that, we may see this scene on the stone as an image of defeated Vikings preparing their slain warriors for burial. Jane Geddes has interpreted the inclusion of images of horse sacrifice on Sweno stone as reflecting Christian revulsion at an abhorrent pagan practice. I'm not sure that I personally feel able to fathom what was in the minds of the people who commissioned, designed, and carved the monument, but I do find it plausible that the stone commemorates a victory over a pagan Norse enemy. And the iconography and the dating tie in well with the saga accounts of the conquest of parts of Ross and Moray by Sigurd and Thorstein, providing a reasonably plausible historical context. I'd like to finish by making one last speculative suggestion. Sweno stone has some very Pictish characteristics. The cross slab as a form is culturally Pictish, as is the use of David imagery to symbolize kingship. Some of the figures carved on the stone have distinctive ponytail hairstyles that appear elsewhere in Pictish art. But at the same time, art historians have commented on its similarity to Gaelic and Irish high crosses, like this one from Monaster Boyce in Ireland, particularly the tall ring-headed cross and the tightly packed rows of figures. So I wonder, this is very speculative, if Sweno stone, as well as commemorating a victory over the Northmen, also commemorates a coming together of Pictish Moreb and Gaelic Ross. These grooves in the top right-hand corner there, these grooves scored into the base of the stone underneath this image of possibly the arming of David, have been interpreted as evidence of swearing of oaths of allegiance made by drawing a sword across the stone. And it has been proposed, again by Jane Geddes, that these little figures down in the bottom right-hand corner there, on the side of the stone. These little figures may be secular rulers concluding a treaty. So going very much out on a limb, I wonder if the treaty in question was one of alliance between Ros and Moreb. It would be satisfying to think that Sweno Stone was not raised by the ruler of a remote Pictish or Scottish overkingdom, but was instead a monument that lay at the heart of early medieval Ros and Moreb, two small kingdoms that banded together in the late 9th century to repel the existential threat of encroaching Norse invaders. There we are. So just to sum up, not many historians have looked at this period in the Firthlands because of the lack of textual sources, but we've seen 3 early texts that suggest there were 2 small polities in the region in the 8th and 9th centuries called Ros and Moreb, Ross and Moray. Mapping different types of evidence from sculpture and archaeology to place names, saints' dedications, ogham inscriptions and handbells has made it possible to discern the imprints of these 2 polities, both of them occupying land on either side of the Moray Firth. There's also faint evidence to suggest that they were both kingdoms. Drawing on the difficult evidence of the Icelandic sagas, it's possible to envisage that the northern parts of these territories were captured and occupied by Norse invaders in the late 9th century. And the recent carbon redating project at Sweno Stone, combined with a new analysis of its iconography, suggests that it's just possible that the stone preserves a record and a memory of that conflict. However, even by bringing all of this evidence together, we still don't have a clear view of the fortunes of the Firthlands in these truly dark ages. But hopefully this has cast a bit more light into the darkness and paved the way for more research to come. So thank you very much indeed for listening, especially when there were other options available this evening. You can follow my research. I write a blog, so you can follow my research on my blog here on Substack, and that is my email at the University of Glasgow. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Fiona. That's wonderful. Very erudite.